All right, everyone, welcome back to the Golf Unfiltered podcast. It's a very special episode of the Golf Unfiltered podcast, and it's always special when we're able to welcome back a longtime friend of the program, Mike Stachura, senior editor of equipment over at Golf Digest. Mike, how you doing?
Great, Adam. How about you?
I'm doing well, man. Nothing, like I said before we got going here, man, just causing a stir on a Friday night news drop about this golf ball rollback announcement coming next week. That's pretty wild, huh?
Well, I think obviously that's been in works, and if you paid attention to what Martin Slumbers, the CEO of the RNA, said last week, he kind of hinted that something was coming, and then he hinted what wasn't coming, so that kind of narrowed down the options. And I don't uh, I don't dispute the fact that I have a lot of connections, and but I wouldn't necessarily say that I had to uh, embark on Woodward and Bernstein to get at this.
Yeah.
Obviously, there are folks who are very interested in and very involved in what this might mean, and so it 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 one thing led to another, and we kind of got to the point where we know it's coming and we know what it is. So let's go with it. Great team of editors helping me make it happen. But at the end of the day, I don't think anybody's really surprised that they were going to do something.
Right.
I think a lot of people are surprised the way this thing appears to be headed to a rollout.
Yeah, and I'm surprised. I'm one of those people, and we'll get into it, of course. But just to kind of level set for some of the viewers and listeners, you and I have been talking for a while, and I'm going to bring up a graphic here, Mike. I was kind of researching one of the earlier times when we talked. This was 5 years ago. We were talking about the golf ball distance debate back in 2018. I mean, so clearly this has been a topic that has been ongoing. I mean, before we get into your article and before the preemptive or the eventual announcement next week, distance is such a premium topic of conversation among golfers. Why is that when we talk about the two worlds of golf? We've got the pro side, of course, and then we've got regular guys like me and you. I mean, why is distance such a big deal?
I mean, basically, I think it is the boundaries of the playing field,
Mhm.
right? So, uh, if you can imagine, if somebody went to a historic baseball stadium and every game there were 30 home runs hit,
Right.
there would be kind of this disconnect between those who knew baseball in the 50s and those who are watching it now, and they would say, we that's the game we wanted back in the 50s. And then there's another group that's saying, what's wrong with this? That's just where we are today. And so
Right.
there's the natural boundary question, and obviously golf courses have gone to some lengths over time to continue to expand to sort of respond to distance at the elite level. And I think the sort of unknown, unspoken aspect of this is the group that is concerned about distance and believes that it either needs to be reined in some way or even reversed somehow hasn't completely explained the fear behind what they don't like. In other words,
Mm-hmm.
what's the great tragedy? And clearly they acknowledge that this is not a problem for 99.9% of the golfing world. But to their credit, they believe there should be this kind of connection between the elite game and any other level of the game. And that historically has been the great appeal of golf, that we're all playing essentially the same
Mm-hmm.
game. And I think that's why distance has, depending on whatever adjective you want to put on it, is prickly or a crisis or uh, the end of the world as we know it. And so I think
Right.
that's there's a disconnect between elite and average golfers, and yet there's this universal connection at the same time. And how do you answer both of those things if you see one as a problem and the other not as a problem?
Mm,
I think
yeah.
obviously the ruling bodies have wrestled with this for, I think it's close to 100 years, really.
Hmm.
And I think the challenge that they faced is, if we break that connection, how do we solve the universal appeal? And if we maintain that connection, how do we protect the sort of limited playing field that our greatest athletes, golfers, are performing on?
Yeah. Yeah, fair, very fair. And so your article that dropped last night, and here's another graphic. It's the USGA RNA to announce universal golf ball rollback next week. Let's talk a little bit about what the rollback actually means. So, for my understanding, and for the listener's sake, I mean, this isn't necessarily the USGA saying manufacturers have to change the ball. It's just that we're actually changing the parameters of the testing. Is that pretty accurate?
Based on my reporting, what I know, what I believe is going to be the case, obviously the governing bodies have decided to look at distance, and one of the early proposals was, we're going to change this test, what we call the overall distance standard, which is a very complicated test, but in its simplest form, a golf ball hit by a driver on a robot can't go farther than 317 yards plus three when the robot swings at 120 miles an hour.
Hmm.
The change that we think is happening next week is that test, instead of at 120-mile-an-hour clubhead speed, will be at 125 miles an hour. And there's a whole series of things where the original proposal earlier this spring was, we're going to change it to 127, and it's only going to apply to golf balls used in professional tours and other elite amateur events.
Mm-hmm.
So it was called a model local rule.
Right.
The sort of fundamental change that we're anticipating happening next week is this idea of a model local rule will be a temporary situation. So starting in 2028, the test will be 125 miles an hour for the overall distance standard for elite, amateur, and professional events. So kind of like uh, the basic idea of the model local rule, but tied into that, in 2030, this will be the rule for all golf balls in terms of making them conforming. That doesn't
Okay.
mean that a manufacturer has to make golf balls only to this standard. Historically, the only golf balls that are ever sold are in serious quantities are golf balls that conform to the rules.
Right.
And so there's a whole discussion about whether there will be an audience for non-conforming equipment. Uh, the practicalities of actually eliminating non-conforming balls from the face of the earth, which is ludicrous and probably not going to happen.
Right.
And how manufacturers are going to approach this situation, and whether in fact professional tours are going to endorse this situation, because they've come out and said in the recent past they weren't supporting the model local rule, but they were looking for some other kind of solution. Maybe this is that solution. It's hard to say what the conversations have been between the ruling bodies and the various stakeholders. I can tell you, in talking to a fair number of manufacturers, they've already acknowledged that this is a real enough thing that they're working on
Mhm.
products and patents to develop golf balls that would meet this new standard. So they're probably not thrilled with the idea of trying to sell a shorter golf ball,
Right.
if in fact that's what they're going to try to sell. I think there's a whole host of unknowns, and I think manufacturers uh, are smart enough to realize that, hey, they've made rules that restricted our theoretical development process, and we're still here, and we've just had, probably the best 3 years of business that we've had in a quarter century. So I like our chances to figure it out. That may be the
Yeah,
attitude a lot of manufacturers have.
I would agree with that attitude if they did have that, because let's face it. I mean, I don't have to tell you this. We've got some really, really smart people that work at these brands. And I mean, I think it's important for listeners to understand that they will probably figure this out. Not even probably, they will figure this out to some degree. But the other side of it too, Mike, is obviously when news breaks like this, everyone starts thinking, well, what does this mean for me? And that one of the bigger things that I noticed, of course, and you mentioned it earlier, was this conversation shifted from only the elite players to now all golfers, which I found to be surprising. And if I, speaking in generalities here, the testing parameter change could equate to roughly about 15-yard difference, if my math is correct, which for most amateur players, the 99.9% that we referenced, are we going to notice that? What's your view on that?
Well, I will tell you this, that if the dates hold and we're looking at 2030 for these balls to be the conforming balls for all of us, if you give the combined R&D departments 6 years to solve a problem, I don't know that they're going to solve it completely. I mean, you look at the groove situation, right? I
Right.
think you can make the case that in a lot of ways, wedges today are better than they were uh, when they were non-conforming. I think
Right. Yeah.
there's been more innovation. There's been more ways to get us the right wedge. I think golf balls are going to be a similar situation, and the research is unclear what this actually means. There's essentially two ways for manufacturers and designers to attack this problem. So, in other words, if you increase the club head speed on the test, the way to make the ball still pass the test is either make it slower. In other words, the
Hmm.
core is less resilient, or you make the aerodynamics, the dimple pattern, much worse.
Right.
Likely, there's a combination of both of those things that is a sweet spot for a manufacturer to kind of give you the best of what you need. Let's say that ultimately means a 5% decline at the elite level. I don't know exactly if that's how that's going to play out, but let's just say that's the number. Um, there is some thinking that it's 5% all the way down the line.
Mm.
So if you swing at 125 miles an hour, it's 5%. And if you swing at 85 miles an hour or 65 miles an hour, it's 5%. I
Wow.
think that's sketchy, uncertain. I think there are a lot of different things that can happen in terms of the golf ball you choose to use as your swing speed decreases. So I think that 5% number is not firm. I think there's going to be an opportunity for manufacturers to say, hey, I know you love playing the number one ball on tour. We have a different ball for you that's going to give you less of a penalty and give you the same sort of performance, professional level performance around the green. So I think there's an opportunity for manufacturers. I think this is a public opinion kind of marketing challenge in terms of uh, how first the governing bodies make the case that this is not going to affect average golfers that much,
Hmm.
and two, how equipment companies are going to look at the issue and say, "Hey, you're losing less than a professional. We've we've clawed back some of the yardage you thought you were going to lose. This is not a big deal." So it's it's kind of uh, a unique situation for golf because there will be a sense of, well, our entire business has been um, driven by play what the pros play,
Right.
and now there could be a situation where don't play what the pros play. You're going to get better playing this specific product for you. So it's there's a lot of public relations and marketing and uncertainty about how this thing gets navigated going forward, and let's also acknowledge that the very existence of the governing body's authority is in question at this moment too.
Right. Yeah. I mean, golf certainly is a trepidatious place right now. Um, so a couple things you mentioned there, specifically about the manufacturers. Obviously, with your work with your partner, E. Michael Johnson, coming up with the hot list, every single year, you speak to these manufacturers regularly. Um, Correct me if I'm wrong, but were they notified of something? I believe it was 3 years ago. Am I right on that? So they were at least given
Oh,
notice.
oh, sure. This has been a technically, if you go back to even before the groove research process began, basically at that time, I want to say kind of around 2004, 2005,
Oh wow. Okay.
the USGA basically notified manufacturers, hey, we're interested in studying distance. Could you submit golf balls that are 15 to 25 yards shorter? Now, not a lot of manufacturers probably did that. Some did. And the USGA had a lot of these golf balls to do some testing with, a lot of regular golfer testing with,
Right.
to see what that impact was like. So given that announcement 15, 16, 18 years ago, you can check the sort of patent office and you can see that there have been patents for reduced distance golf balls going back to 2008.
Oh wow. Okay.
So the specifics may not have been always known at the time, but patents are generally broad, so the innovation is going to happen across a range of weights and resiliencies, et cetera, et cetera. So, but yeah, manufacturers have known that this is a potentiality, and that they're sort of working the both sides of the street, right? We're going to
Right.
have our team develop answers to this technology, and then we're also going to kind of work the ref on this and say, uh, you know, do we really have to do this? And if you're a good major ball company, you've got an answer ready while you're
Mhm.
still trying to make sure that you don't have to use that answer.
Right. You always need that contingency plan, right?
Yeah.
So one of the arguments for the rollback has been land, running out of land. These golf courses potentially becoming obsolete. We, of course, have seen over the years, most notably Augusta National and many others, golf courses being lengthened. Do you anticipate, this is conjecture at this point since it's still very early, but do you anticipate these projects being put on hold for expanding golf courses? Is that still something that's needed in the golf space?
I think that is a huge motivating factor in the decision making process. I think there's some concerns about environmental impact on golf courses. I think those are somewhat ill-founded because we're still talking about a very, very, very small percentage of the universe that has the capacity to make a golf course play too short, whatever that means.
Mhm. Right.
Uh, y- you know, I think golf courses are going to be renovated for as long as there are golf courses. Are they going to be necessarily have to be lengthened? I think that sort of depends on what the golf course sees as its client base, or what it's trying to attract. Uh, will Augusta National have to buy up more land? Boy, that's really, I can't imagine a scenario where an 8,000-yard golf course is the standard.
Right.
Certainly possible, and I think that was the fear behind the governing bodies when they look at someone like Kyle Berkshire and say, "Hey, this is the prototype for what professional golfers will be." I don't
Mhm.
think there's any evidence that that's going to be the prototype. I just don't think consistent performance with 220-mile-an-hour ball speed is where golf is going. Also agree with Sasha McKenzie, the great biomechanist, tremendous golf researcher. This rule, if it goes into place, will fast forward developing a faster swing. So
Oh, yeah.
every elite player will be swinging faster. They're just it has to happen. And you know, love Brian Harmon, but if his days weren't numbered and his type wasn't numbered, I think a tour will not have space for players who do not swing, you know, conveniently without too much effort, 120 miles an hour.
A lot of premium is being put on the golf ball, of course, but we all know there are other variables to distance. Driver conformity. That's been a hot topic as well, especially on the PGA Tour side. I mean, with equipment manufacturers hearing all of this, are golf balls just being singled out? Should there be focus other places, and will there be focus on other pieces of equipment?
Well, when the USGA and R&A published their sort of areas of interest, driver was one of those things that they were looking at in terms of changing, what's known as the characteristic time, or basically the spring-like effect, and rolling that back as well, and again rolling it back for elite competitions. I think, given what they've said in the past, I think there was definitely an interest in looking at other pieces of equipment. I think there was a concern for making that universal, that was undue hardship on the average consumer. So I think that's problematic. I think there is a legitimate chance that a reduced driver volume rule might be put in place for elite competition. I don't see a problem with that. I don't see why they wouldn't consider doing that, but they have a monumental hurdle to navigate first. How do we make the case that this has to be done, and it has to be done for all golfers? I think what their argument is going to be is it's a minimal effect on average golfers, and a necessary preventative measure for elite golf. Lost in all of this, as my good friend Stina Sternberg has recently pointed out, is women and girls.
Yep, I saw that as well.
Sure. I don't know exactly, but the clubhead speeds that we're talking about are in some cases 70 miles an hour slower, and you're going to take distance away from them when there are no tees even more forward for them to play. So
Right.
again, the PR campaign that the governing bodies need to put together will need to not be half-hearted.
Yeah. Well, and there's certainly a lot of variables to consider as you're expressing. And, when I think about this, and when any of the types of golfers see this, I mean, this isn't going to make golf more fun for us. I mean, but that wasn't the point. It was something on the other end of that spectrum that we need to protect versus, and I'm just kind of expressing some of the arguments, but is it meant to protect against as opposed to heighten the enjoyment of the game? Or is that just an argument that really doesn't hold much basis here, because they're not going to stop playing golf, right?
Personally, professionally, I hope they don't. But I think is the game going to be less fun at the elite level? Boy, that's hard to say, but hey, every Sunday we watch NFL football. Do you think those guys are always having fun? No.
No.
Okay. People are trying to rip their heads off. Golf is, I don't want to say it's too easy. It's not too easy at the elite level. If you made it more difficult at the elite level, would anybody feel bad? No. And let's face it, there are certain among us who watch professional golf for the car crashes. There aren't many. There might be a few more. And how they respond to those car crashes is interesting, and you could say fun. Will the game change so dramatically for the recreational player that it stops being fun? Boy, that's a hard situation. I mean, is a 10-yard loss of distance on your tee shot a tragedy so much that you head straight to the pickleball court? Man, I just think there's more of a link, a passion, it's more part of you than that. Now,
Right.
let's be clear, it's not just gonna be 10 yards or whatever lost on your tee shot. It's another 5 to 8 on your 7 iron. And so all of a sudden, a 370-yard, 5-yard par 4 could be driver 5 iron. Is that fun? Now, if there's a tee at 360, are you okay playing that tee? I
Right.
if it's more fun, I don't see any trouble moving to that tee box. So I think there's a whole scenario of kind of golfer ego reset that's part of this. And if somebody's playing a 6,700 yard golf course as their normal length, and all of a sudden they're hitting one or two more clubs into a green, and after 6 months or 2 years or whatever the number is, at some point they decide that's not fun anymore. But they don't say, well, I'm not going to play anymore. They say, let's move up to the whites.
Right.
Right.
Exactly.
And as somebody who just turned 60, I might be moving up to something that's not white before too long, but I still want to play, I think. And I mean, I just heard Lee Trevino this morning on the radio. He's 84 and he just found something.
Yeah.
Still working on his game.
The
So,
search never ends. Yeah.
right, and he's obviously hitting it shorter, and he says, I know I hit it shorter, but I know I want to keep playing. Want to keep searching. So I think the connection to the game is going to, overcome any sort of rule-making impediment or hurdle that you have to get over, and the interest will stay there.
I agree with you. And a lot of things that golfers recently have been frustrated about, such as slow play, people playing from the wrong tee box, as you were kind of discussing. Um, let's face it, there is potentially a positive impact that this makes for golfers. I mean, maybe slow play decreases. There's all these. I think we as golfers, whenever we hear something, or maybe even we as humans, when we hear something is being taken away, or reduced, we have a immediate negative reaction to that. But there's also that other side of the coin, isn't there?
Well, I mean, we have the recent example of the groove rule.
Mhm.
Something was taken away. In other words, wedges spun less from the rough in wet conditions immediately going forward in 2010. It has not impacted interest in the game at all. It has,
Nope.
I would say, as we spoke earlier, it inspired manufacturers to solve the wedge problem in different and more intriguing ways, and golfers have benefited from that. I would say recreational players have benefited more than elite players from that. So I think if you're connected to the game, such that you play every Saturday and every Sunday or whatever your interest is, I don't think a rule change ultimately gets in the way of that interest. And if it does, then maybe your connection to the game was just not that strong.
Right. Yeah. Well said. Well said. Well, I know we're just got a couple more minutes here, Mike, and thanks again so much, Mike Stachura from Golf Digest, for coming on. Um, we're thinking early next week. We're thinking just an announcement. Imagine that everyone from manufacturers to entry level golfers are going to hear all this stuff, and there's going to be an immediate reaction if there hasn't been already. But do you anticipate cooler heads prevailing? Is this a matter of people have to kind of just deal with it and will adapt? Or is there I mean, will manufacturers have a case for lawsuits? I mean, how outlandish can this become?
I'm searching for the cooler heads in this. I mean, I think every organization, every situation needs a commissioner of common sense. I'm not sure who has volunteered for that position yet because I haven't
You
seen
could
any.
do it.
Yeah, I have enough non-paying positions. I don't need another one. Uh, but right. I mean, I think my friend David Fay, former uh, CEO, USGA, executive director, said that we govern by the authority not vested in us. So in other words, the governing bodies are relevant because golfers think they're relevant. And so the onus is on the governing bodies to say, hey, we're still relevant. And this is why we do this. And we're going to engage in a conversation about why we're relevant and about why we think this is necessary. The manufacturers are in a position to do anything. Yes, file lawsuits, trot out all their tour players to say this is an unnecessary hardship for the game. We don't need it. The game is growing. This is an impediment to future growth, and make it as ugly as they possibly can, to the point where maybe they believe that they can change the minds of the governing bodies and they'll just dismiss this idea going forward.
Right.
I think there needs to be somebody to make the case that this is not a hardship for any level of the game, and I don't know that either side has made the case.
Right.
And I think I don't know who the person to come forward and say, listen, the game is the thing. Okay. Your interest in it is not about these equipment regulations. That doesn't have anything to do with why you continue to play. I think why you continue to play, let's examine that. And if you're honest with yourself, you just want to get out on the golf course. Let's get back to that.
Totally. And final thought. I've been impressed by some of the manufacturers who have responded favorably to this, or at least we're going to work along this. Like our friends over at Bridgestone. I mean, people who listen to this know that we have a partnership with them, but they're an example of a company that has said, look, we will get this figured out, much like what we were talking about before. And it's not lost on us that there's a really, really big voice of golf that is affiliated with that particular brand in Tiger Woods, who happens to also be, if we believe his past comments, pro rollback. Now,
Yes.
so to your point about, who's going to be the commissioner of common sense. I mean, Tiger seems to definitely be a default name that pops into mind, but we will have to see how that unfolds.
Well, I think it's fair to say that Tiger doesn't want to continue to finish in the bottom half of any tournament, but he would like to lead something. This would be a great thing for him to lead.
Fair enough. That's Mike Stachura, senior editor of equipment over at Golf Digest. Mike, thanks so much on a Saturday for hopping on. I hope you get some rest. It's going to be a busy week, man.
All right. Thanks, Adam. I had a good time. It was great.